Royal ancient DNA was found in ordinary people living today. You are not supposed to have this in your blood, and yet, someone like you already does. Hidden inside the DNA of completely ordinary people, people with no crowns, no palaces, no recorded history, scientists are finding genetic markers that once belonged to the most powerful royal bloodlines in human history. Not distant echoes. Not weak traces. But clear, undeniable signatures of kings. And the strangest part is, these bloodlines were never meant to spread. They were protected, controlled, even isolated for centuries. So how did they end up here, inside people who were never supposed to carry them? Either history is incomplete, or something far more unsettling has been quietly unfolding beneath our understanding of the past. For centuries, royal bloodlines were treated as something almost sacred. Power did not just come from armies or wealth, it came from ancestry. A king was not just a ruler, but a continuation of a lineage believed to be chosen, sometimes even divine. From ancient Egypt to medieval Europe, from imperial China to hidden desert kingdoms, rulers carefully recorded their ancestry, ensuring that their bloodlines remained pure, traceable, and exclusive. Marriages were not based on love, but on preservation. Alliances were formed to protect genetic continuity. Entire systems were built to ensure that royal DNA did not dissolve into the general population. History, at least as it was written, tells us that these bloodlines were guarded with precision. And yet, when modern science began mapping the human genome in detail, something unexpected emerged. As genetic databases expanded, researchers began comparing DNA samples across populations. At first, the goal was simple: to understand migration patterns, ancestry, and inherited traits. But as the data grew, strange patterns started to appear. Individuals with no known aristocratic background were showing genetic links to ancient royal lineages. Not vague similarities, but distinct markers, rare haplogroups, and sequences that had previously been identified in royal remains recovered from archaeological sites. These were not coincidences that could be easily dismissed. They were patterns repeating across continents. At first glance, there is an obvious explanation. Over time, bloodlines mix. Even the most protected lineages eventually blend into the wider population. Wars happen. Kingdoms fall. Records are lost. It is entirely possible that descendants of royalty, over generations, simply became ordinary people. The world has seen countless revolutions where nobles lost their status, where royal families were scattered, where survival meant abandoning identity. In that sense, finding traces of royal DNA in modern individuals might not be surprising at all. It could simply be the natural outcome of history, unfolding over thousands of years. But this explanation begins to weaken under closer inspection, because some of these genetic signatures are not as diluted as they should be. If royal DNA had slowly mixed into the population over centuries, we would expect it to become faint, fragmented, and widely dispersed. Instead, in certain cases, the markers remain unusually strong, almost intact, as if the lineage did not gradually disappear, but instead remained preserved in specific, unexpected pockets of the population. This raises a difficult question. If these bloodlines were meant to fade into the general population, why do they sometimes appear so concentrated in individuals with no recorded connection to royalty? This is where the mystery deepens. Geneticists began looking beyond traditional historical explanations and started examining the data itself. What they found introduced a new layer of complexity. Some of these royal-associated markers were appearing in regions that had no direct historical contact with the original dynasties. In other words, people living thousands of miles away, in completely different cultural and geographical contexts, were carrying genetic signatures linked to ancient rulers they should never have encountered. This was not just a matter of lost records. It suggested that something about the movement of these bloodlines was not fully understood. Several theories began to emerge, each attempting to explain the anomaly, but none providing a complete answer. The first theory remains grounded in conventional history. It proposes that our understanding of migration and social mobility is simply incomplete. According to this view, royal lineages may have spread more widely than recorded, through hidden relationships, unacknowledged offspring, or undocumented movements across regions. Over centuries, these hidden branches could have integrated into ordinary populations, leaving behind genetic traces that only modern science can now detect. This explanation is plausible, but it relies heavily on the assumption that historical records are far less accurate than we believe. A second theory takes a more structural approach. It suggests that what we identify as royal DNA may not actually belong exclusively to royalty. Instead, these genetic markers could represent traits that were more common in ancient populations, but only became associated with royalty because those individuals were more likely to be preserved, studied, and recorded. In this scenario, the apparent exclusivity of royal DNA is an illusion created by the way history has been documented. What we are seeing today might not be the spread of royal bloodlines, but rather the rediscovery of ancient genetic patterns that were never truly rare to begin with. But there is a third theory, one that is more difficult to dismiss, yet far more unsettling. It suggests that some royal bloodlines were not simply preserved, but intentionally distributed. According to this idea, certain lineages may have been spread into the general population through deliberate, controlled means. Not randomly, not accidentally, but with purpose. This theory does not rely on missing records or statistical coincidences. Instead, it implies a level of awareness and intention that challenges our understanding of ancient societies. If true, it would mean that the separation between royalty and common people was never as absolute as it appeared. The turning point in this mystery came with a series of genetic studies conducted by research teams analyzing ancient remains alongside modern DNA databases. By extracting genetic material from well-preserved royal burials and comparing it with contemporary samples, scientists were able to identify specific markers linked to known dynasties. What they expected to find was a gradual dilution of these markers over time. What they found instead was inconsistency. In some populations, the markers were almost non-existent. In others, they appeared with unexpected frequency and strength. The distribution was uneven, unpredictable, and resistant to simple explanations. One particular case drew significant attention. A group of individuals living in an area with no recorded connection to a specific ancient dynasty were found to share a rare genetic sequence previously identified in royal remains from thousands of years earlier. The statistical probability of this occurring by chance was extremely low. Researchers double-checked their methods, reanalyzed the data, and considered the possibility of contamination. But the results remained consistent. The connection was real, and it could not be easily explained by known historical pathways. At this point, the narrative begins to shift. The question is no longer just about how royal DNA survived. It becomes a question of how it moved, how it remained intact, and why it appears where it does. One emerging idea focuses on the concept of genetic bottlenecks, moments in history where populations shrink dramatically, causing certain genetic traits to become more concentrated. If individuals carrying royal markers happened to survive such events, their genetic signatures could become disproportionately prominent in future generations. This could explain the strength of the markers, but it does not fully account for their geographical distribution. Another possibility involves selective inheritance. Not all genetic traits are passed down equally. Some markers persist more strongly due to evolutionary advantages or structural stability within the genome. If certain royal-associated markers had properties that made them more likely to survive across generations, they could remain detectable even after extensive mixing with other populations. This would make them appear more exclusive than they actually are. Yet even this explanation struggles to account for the patterns observed in recent studies. To understand the deeper implications, it helps to step away from the data for a moment and consider a simple, human perspective. Imagine discovering that your DNA contains a direct link to a lineage you have never heard of. Not a distant, diluted connection, but something measurable, something scientifically verified. It would challenge your sense of identity. It would raise questions about your past, your ancestry, and the stories you have been told about where you come from. Now imagine that. This is not an isolated case, but a pattern, repeating across thousands of individuals, each one carrying a fragment of a history that does not fully belong to them. What makes this phenomenon so compelling is not just the science, but the tension between what we believe about history and what the evidence suggests. We tend to think of the past as something fixed, something recorded and understood. But genetic data is revealing a different picture, one that is fluid, complex, and sometimes contradictory. It shows us that lineage is not as simple as names in a record. That identity is not confined to what is written in history books. The deeper twist lies in the realization that royal bloodlines may never have been as isolated as we imagined. Instead of being separate from the general population, they may have always been intertwined with it, moving quietly through generations, appearing and disappearing in ways that defy easy explanation. The boundaries between royal and ordinary begin to blur, not because one became the other, but because they were never entirely separate to begin with. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of this entire mystery. If the markers we associate with power, status, and historical importance are not confined to those who held titles, then what does that say about the way we understand hierarchy itself? It suggests that the difference between a king and an ordinary person may not be written in their DNA, but in the stories that survive about them. In the end, this is not just a story about genetics. It is a story about how we interpret the past, how we define identity, and how much of what we believe is shaped by incomplete information. The discovery of royal DNA in ordinary people does not simply rewrite history, it complicates it. It reminds us that the past is not a straight line, but a web of connections, many of which remain hidden until the right tools reveal them. And somewhere, in the quiet background of modern life, these connections continue to exist. Invisible, unrecognized, and still not fully understood. The question did not disappear after those discoveries, it became more precise. If these royal genetic signatures are still present today, then they are not just remnants of the past, they are active, living fragments, moving through time. And that forces a new line of thinking. Not about where they came from, but about what they are doing now. As researchers expanded their datasets, something even more unusual began to emerge. These royal-associated markers were not randomly scattered across the population. In certain regions, they appeared in clusters, groups of individuals who, despite having no known connection to each other, shared overlapping genetic traits linked to ancient dynasties. It was subtle, but consistent enough to raise a new possibility. What if these patterns are not just historical accidents? What if they follow a structure we haven't fully recognized yet? One team began analyzing not just ancestry, but behavioral and physiological correlations. The goal was not to prove anything extraordinary, but to explore whether these markers had any measurable effect. And while most results remained inconclusive, a few patterns stood out. Certain individuals carrying these rare sequences showed similarities in cognitive traits, stress responses, and even decision-making tendencies. Nothing dramatic, nothing definitive, but enough to suggest that these markers might not be entirely neutral. This shifts the mystery into a different dimension. Because if these genetic fragments are not just historical artifacts, but functional pieces of biology, then their persistence becomes more significant. It would mean that what we are seeing is not just the survival of royal bloodlines, but the survival of something within those bloodlines, something that continues to pass from one generation to the next. There is another angle that researchers have started to consider, one that is less about history and more about probability. In a global population of billions, even extremely rare genetic traits can appear in unexpected places simply due to scale. Given enough time and enough people, patterns that seem impossible can emerge naturally. This explanation is mathematically sound, and it offers a grounded way to interpret the data. But it does not fully address the consistency of certain findings, especially when the same rare markers appear repeatedly in specific groups. So the tension remains. On one side, a rational explanation grounded in statistics and incomplete historical records. On the other, a pattern that feels too structured, too persistent to be entirely random. And between them, a gap that science has not yet closed. Imagine, for a moment, that you are one of these individuals. You live an ordinary life. Your past, as far as you know, is simple, traceable, unremarkable. And then a test reveals something unexpected, a genetic link to a lineage that once ruled empires. It does not change your daily life, but it changes how you see yourself. Not because you become something different, but because you realize that identity is deeper than what is visible. It exists at a level most of us never think about. And maybe that is where the real answer begins to take shape. Not in the idea that royal DNA is hidden among us, but in the realization that the boundaries we draw between people, between powerful and ordinary, between past and present, are far less solid than we assume. The past does not stay behind us. It moves with us, quietly, encoded in ways we are only beginning to understand. So the mystery remains open. Not solved, not finished, but evolving. And perhaps that is exactly where it belongs. Because some discoveries are not meant to give us clear answers. They are meant to change the questions we ask. If this story made you think differently about history and identity, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below.